Hello again, everybody. This is lecture 2 in marine ecology, marine and aquatic ecology, and today's topic is sex ratio and mating considered as evolved adaptive strategies to pass your genes on to the next generation. And just to recap what we've been talking about so far, to put things in context, remember ecology is actually comprised of several subfields, and those subfields exist within three broad levels of organization of biology: organisms, populations, and communities. And in this course, we're treating these as separate segments of the course. So right now we're in the organisms segment, and we're looking at physiological, behavioral, and life history ecology of organisms. And basically, the challenge is to understand how organisms interact with their environment and how that interaction has shaped the evolution of organisms to cause them to fit their environment, to become adapted to their environment. So, to understand why organisms are the way they are, to understand why they have the physiology that they do, why they have the behavior that they do, why they have the life history that they have. And the intellectual framework that we use to make those inferences is basically Darwin's framework of natural selection that he outlined in chapter 3 of his book, Origin of Species. That chapter is still as valid today as it was back then when it was written. So there are two components of fitness. There's survival and reproduction. And we're starting our understanding of the evolution of organisms and the traits of organisms with that second function, that second component of fitness, namely reproduction. And we started with the most fundamental question about reproduction, namely whether you reproduce, how do you reproduce, sexually or asexually? And we're continuing along those lines with slightly more details regarding your reproductive mode. So we're assuming that we have organisms that are reproducing sexually, and we're asking some basic questions about their sexual reproduction. For example, if you're a female, what should the sex ratio of your offspring be? Or another type of question, should you be male or should you be female? Should you be just one sex? So should you be both sexes? Should you change from one sex to another sex during your life? And how those choices depend on what kind of environment you're in or what kind of organism you are: vertebrate, invertebrate, plant. So corals, flatworms, cuttlefish, shrimp, crabs, gobies, wrasses, elephant seals, albatross, and so on. And we want to answer those questions by understanding how that particular strategy of reproduction is, in some sense, a good solution to some problem in the environment. Solution meaning it maximizes the ability of that organism to pass its genes on to the next generation. And in this case, the part of the environment that we're considering here is the most intimate part of any organism's environment that reproduces sexually, namely its mating partner. So, an organism's social environment or mating environment creates a set of predictable problems and obstacles that select for certain types of physiology and behavior regarding the mating process. And those are the adaptations that we're going to consider today. So last lecture, we looked at the cost of meiosis, so-called, or the cost of producing males, and the evolutionary ecology of sexual reproduction. And first, I argued that females that reproduce asexually have an intrinsically higher fitness than those who reproduce sexually, and we illustrated that with a lab exercise. And as a result, we should expect that asexual females should be everywhere, basically. They should be the norm in nature. But they're not. So we discussed two possible reasons why this hasn't happened, why sexuality is the norm in most species. First is that asexual females might accumulate harmful mutations each generation, and enough to cut their fitness in half. And sexual reproduction creates the opportunity to shuffle out those mutations in at least some of the progeny and then regenerate mutation-free progeny, at least some. And the second possibility is that asexual females might lose their resistance to pathogens that evolve very rapidly, microbes, bacteria, and viruses, so that their fitness drops in half each generation. And in that case, sexuality prevents this by shuffling new combinations of resistance genes into existence each generation that the pathogens haven't seen yet and haven't figured out how to overcome yet. And John Maynard Smith called these two hypotheses the engine gearbox and the red queen hypotheses for the evolutionary maintenance of sexual reproduction. So these seem to be good possible hypotheses that could, at least in theory, provide selective advantages for sexual reproduction. So, for example, from the female's point of view, females that are capable of producing asexually, why should they reproduce sexually? And why, in other words, why should there be males in the population? Or from the female's point of view, in what way can males enhance the fitness of females, or what are males good for females? Well, there are two possible answers. One, males produce females with mutation-free genes, which might make up for or replace the mutations that females have experienced during their lifetimes. As a result of Mendelian segregation of alleles at a locus and recombination that occurs during sexual reproduction. So it's unlikely that the male that female mates with has exactly the same mutations at the same loci as she does. So their genomes complement each other. So the mutations that she has are compensated for by the wild type healthy alleles that the male has, and vice versa. So that's one possibility. The second possibility why males are advantageous to females are that males provide females with different combinations of parasite-resistant genes. And these different combinations allow females to produce offspring that are different from themselves, different enough that they look alien to parasites. Okay, they look alien to the parasites. Parasites haven't figured out yet how to attack those organisms and infect them and make use out of them. And so they could be more resistant to those rapidly evolving parasites than they would be if they were genetically identical to their mothers, had the exact same physiology and other characteristics that the parasites have already evolved to become adapted to. Parasites evolve very rapidly, as we know from our experience with coronavirus. So then how would we refute this argument in favor of asexuality, that since half of your potential mating partners, if you're sexual, are genetically superior and the other half are inferior on average, and there should be no net benefit on average to mixing your genes? So how do we refute that argument with these two hypotheses? Well, the way you do that is, mixing can be advantageous regardless of who your mating partner is. So according to the engine gearbox hypothesis, any new mutation you receive is extremely unlikely to be carried by anyone else in the population. So no matter who you mate with, your new mutations can segregate out of your progeny. Of course, it's also to a female's advantage to mate with males containing as few mutations as possible, but that might be difficult or impossible to know. Nevertheless, there is some evidence that females choose a mate in part on the basis of the number of mutational load that that individual might be carrying, and that's subject of female choice. Lots of interesting experiments on the subject of female choice and how females choose males in different species of animals and perhaps in plants also. But still, the point is, no matter who that mating partner is, a female can still benefit because it's extremely unlikely that that mating partner will have the exact same mutated loci as the female does herself. So no matter who she mates with, she is giving her the potential to produce at least some offspring that are mutation free simply by mixing those alleles with her mating partner. And a similar argument can be used with the red queen. So according to the red queen, if a pathogen evolves ability to overcome your combination of resistance genes, it might well be the case that any new combination of resistance genes is better than yours because the pathogen has already evolved to overcome yours. So anything new might be better than yours. So it really doesn't matter who you mate with. You're getting a new set of resistance genes that the pathogen hasn't seen before. So it may not necessarily be the case, it's not really necessary to argue that individuals are looking for a genetically superior mating partner. It just may be sufficient that the mating partner is genetically different. That's all it takes to favor sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. Okay, but anyway, right now, these two hypotheses are the only ones that are really taken seriously by most workers in the field to explain the persistence of sexual reproduction. So currently, there's no consensus which is most likely to be true in general. In fact, both could be true to different degrees in different species. There's no reason why, they don't contradict each other. And there's a lot of active research still going on just basic questions. So, for example, how do we explain obligately asexual species? So, for example, large groups of rotifers are obligately asexual, and there are some terrestrial species like aphids that are obligately asexual, and there are hybrid fish that are obligately asexual. And so, how do we explain them? Have they evolved some sort of super resistance to parasites? Have they evolved the ability to correct their genetic mutations before they cause any harm? Do they hold secrets that humans can use to prevent disease, infectious disease, or maybe degenerative genetic disease caused by mutations? Or do they just live in habitats that are pretty much free of mutagens, like UV light or high temperatures, and free of pathogens? Also, why are there so few examples of mutations causing asexuality in birds and mammals, if there are any? And of course, several labs are working on individual case studies, looking at specific examples, species, looking for the role of selection and the environment on evolution of sexual or asexual reproduction in some species of interest, like this fish here, these hybrid fish of red-bellied and fine-scaled dace, which are freshwater fish in the carp and minnow families. So, an active area of very interesting research. And then just one last video I forgot to show you guys last time on it demonstrates asexual reproduction in mushroom corals.
Mushroom corals of the genus Sacrophyton employ several reproductive strategies that include asexual bud production. Asexual budding has been proposed as a mechanism to enable certain corals, such as fungiids, to recolonize a site following the mortality or injury of a parent pulp, and could also be a last-effort strategy to a stressed coral to propagate. This footage shows a fungiid coral releasing an asexual bud in an aquarium environment. Aquarium corals of this genus are known to bud when conditions are suboptimal, serving as a warning signal of being stressed. Note that during the release of the bud, the coral is folded in and the pulps are retracted. but reopens and extends its pulps after 1 hour of the bud's release. This behavior during budding may be due to change in hydrostatic pressure to help release the coral's bud.
Okay, so now we want to move on to the next topic, which is trying to understand organisms, the evolution of an organism's sex type and sex ratio in a population, and understand these phenomena as a response to the environment or evolutionary response to the environment. But first, before doing that, I want to just point out that these arguments don't fit at all on this conceptual framework here of the struggle for existence in Chapter 3 of The Origin of Species, because we're not talking about a large population growing to deplete resources, resulting in competition for resources. It just simply doesn't apply. This logic just does not apply. And at least in many cases, a different logic applies, and that different logic is not in Chapter 3 of The Origin of Species. In fact, we have to move to Chapter 4 of The Origin to find this new logic. And this new logic is called not natural selection, but it's called sexual selection, which is the second big insight, major insight that Darwin introduced in his book, Origin of Species. All right, so here we have chapter 4, where Darwin goes into more detail about natural selection to argue that it can be just as effective in causing evolution as artificial selection that humans practice in their domestic animals. And in addition, in this chapter, he introduces a new topic, sexual selection. So here he defines sexual selection on page 88. Sexual selection depends not on a struggle for existence, but on a struggle between the males for possession of the females. And what's the result? The result of that struggle is not death to the unsuccessful competitor, as it would be in the struggle for existence, but just few offspring, fewer or no offspring. All right, so Darwin conceived of sexual selection as competition between males for mates. But since his definition, the modern definition has been expanded to include competition within either sex. So the quintessential example of sexual selection is the peacock, the male peacock, which has this display. And of course, the whole point is that natural selection and sexual selection are two different processes that can act in opposition to each other. So it's necessary to distinguish them. Natural selection, for example, should favor males that do not make themselves conspicuous and obvious to predators, like this male is doing right here. Like if you're a predator of a peacock, it's not too hard to find out where there's a male. So sexual selection could favor the evolution of traits that are not favored by natural selection and vice versa. All right, so let's look at sexual selection in the marine environment. The first question, most basic question, is how do you maximize your fitness in competition with other members of the same sex? How do you maximize your reproductive or mating success in competition with other members of the same sex if you're competing for mating opportunities? So both sexes are competing for mating opportunities within their own sex. All right, so one of the most basic questions you can ask about a species that's reproducing sexually is, do you maximize your mating success as a hermaphrodite or as completely male or completely female individual? Should you have combined or separate sexes? All right, in most vertebrates, the the sexes are separate. So individuals are either entirely male or entirely female. And that condition in plants and sometimes in animals is called diece. That's one way of pronouncing this word. It's the way that I pronounce it anyway. Diece, that means two houses, or just separate sexes, separate male and female individuals. And a synonym of diece that is only used to describe animals is gonochorism. That also means separate sexes. And another word in English is unisexuality, meaning that every individual is just one sex. Okay, so all these words are used. Diece, gonochorism, unisexuality. They're pretty much equivalent. So just to make sure that we're on the same page and we understand what we're talking about, what does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? What's the definition of male? What's the definition of female? So this definition has nothing to do with anatomy, has nothing to do with chromosomes, has nothing to do with behavior. The only criterion is the type of gamete that is produced. In other words, how you reproduce your genes, how you pass on your genes. If you reproduce via sperm, then by definition you're male. If you reproduce via eggs, then by definition you're female. Any other trait in physiology, behavior, anatomy is free to vary in every possible imaginable way. It doesn't make any difference. A biological female reproduces by eggs. A biological male reproduces through sperm. Okay, in general terms, sexes can be separate, and males are different individuals from females, or it's possible for sexes to be combined. Both eggs and sperm can be produced in the same individual, and that's called hermaphroditism in animals. And in plants, the word monese is also sometimes used. And monese is a specific type of hermaphroditism. That's the type in which both sperm and eggs are produced in a plant, but they're produced in different flowers. So you have male flowers or male cones, and female flowers or female cones in the same individual. That's called monese. And seagrasses, many seagrasses, for instance, are monoecious. They have separate male flowers and female flowers on the same individual. If a plant has flowers that produce both sperm and eggs, each flower produces both sex types of gametes, then the term monese is not used. Rather, it is called a hermaphroditic flower. And so that's the terminology for plants. All right, so how are hermaphroditism and diece, how are these mating strategies, reproductive strategies, distributed in the biological world? Well, diece is common in vertebrates and insects. Probably around 95% of all animal species are obligately dioecious. And I just want to take a second to talk about this word gender, which has a completely different meaning in biology than it does in humans, which has more of a socio-political meaning. In plants and animals, the term gender is defined differently. The idea of gender in, for example, a hermaphroditic plant is simply the proportion of all your genes that are passed on through, for example, the female function. So if 80% of all your genes are passed on through your eggs, and 20% of all your genes are passed on through your sperm, if you're a hermaphrodite, then your gender is 80% female and 20% male. It just is a quantitative, empirical description of how you pass on your genes. So in a dioecious species, um, functionally male individuals that produce sperm are 100% male. Functionally female individuals that produce only eggs are 100% female. But an individual that reproduces through both sperm and eggs is functionally hermaphrodite, but his gender could be, say, 90% female or 90% male, depending on how, through which function it reproduces most, or it could be 50% male, 50% female, depending on how it passes on its genes through its male or its female function. So in biological terms, everything comes down to gametes and gamete type. So Bill here is 100% male. Hillary here is 100% female. So hermaphroditism, on the other hand, is more common in invertebrates and plants than it is in vertebrates. And roughly 95% of all plant species are hermaphroditic, though that proportion changes in different habitats. For example, aquatic plants tend to have a higher proportion of dioecious species than terrestrial plants. So dioecism, or separate sexes, or unisexuality, is more common in aquatic plants, including seagrasses, than in terrestrial plants. All right, and we're talking just about the sex type. The sex type is hermaphroditism. The reproductive type is hermaphroditism. We're not talking necessarily about gender. If you're a hermaphrodite, your gender could be anywhere from like 90% male, or 100% male to 100% female, or 50%. So if you're a hermaphroditic plant, your gender depends on which avenue you reproduce through. So, it's important to remember that distinction. So here's a typical hermaphroditic flower, and you can recognize the male and female function in the flower. The female function is the central organ here, the stigma on the top, which receives the pollen, which contain the sperm cells, and the style is the column through which the pollen tube grows down into the ovary to release the sperm cells that fertilize the ovule in the middle of the ovary of the flower. And the male gametes are produced in the pollen cells, which make up the anther, which are released from the anthers, which combined with the filament here constitute the stamen, which is the male organ, the stamen of the flower. So here's a typical mallow flower. You can see the stamens here, the yellow anthers separated from the pistil here, the stigma and the style up here. So why do you think the male function would be separated from the female function in a hermaphroditic flower? Well, it could be selection to promote outcrossing. So it's possible in a hermaphrodite for the sperm produced by that hermaphrodite to fertilize the ovules also produced by that hermaphrodite, and that happens a lot in hermaphrodite plants and animals. However, the offspring from those reproductions often have a very low fitness, and so there's selection against self-fertilization in most hermaphroditic species. And this separation that we're seeing here may have resulted from that selection against self-fertilization. So in other words, the seeds produced by this flower are more likely to have been produced through outcrossing, pollen from a different plant coming in and fertilizing. And also the offspring produced by these pollen grains here might be more likely to to be produced by another plant, an outcrossing event rather than a selfing event. So in a hermaphroditic species, not only do you have gender, proportion of offspring produced through eggs, for example, but you also have an outcrossing rate. You have an outcrossing rate for the ovules for your female function, and you also have an outcrossing rate for your male function within a given hermaphroditic species. And all of these traits are subject to selection, both natural selection and sexual selection. So the gender is subject to selection, the outcrossing rate as well. So hermaphroditism, the typical state in higher plants. Vertebrates, on the other hand, separate sexes, dioicy, gonochorism, as in these elephant seals. Easily distinguishable, the large sperm producer with the trunk, the small egg producer without the trunk, and their newborn baby. So let's think of some selective advantages of different sexual systems. Try and interpret these in terms of both natural selection and also sexual selection, maybe in different types of environments. And in the process, maybe we can explain a little bit about the differences in taxonomic distribution of the different sexual systems. With dioicy, for example, more common in vertebrates, and hermaphroditism more common in higher plants. All right, so you can think of three main advantages of dioicy. One is that dioicy results in enforced outcrossing. In other words, it's impossible for self-fertilization to occur in dioecious species. So if the species is basically passive, reproducing, relying on water currents or air currents, for example, in direct spawners who release their gametes directly into the ocean, dioicy may be the most effective way to prevent self-fertilization. So that's one possible advantage. And pretty much the only other possible advantage is that um, the dioecious condition allows greater specialization and differentiation between the two sex types, males and females. So if you can imagine natural selection and sexual selection acting to design the best possible male and the best possible female function, it might turn out that the best possible functions can only exist in different individuals because there's conflict between the two functions. That there might be physiological conflict or anatomical conflict or behavioral conflict. So if you want to optimize your mating success through the male function, it might be the optimal design might be to eliminate the female function and just focus on the male function, and also vice versa. So those are the two main advantages. It's easier to optimize and specialize a body form for a sexual function if the two are separate. And the other advantage is the outcrossing advantage. Okay, and what are the advantages of hermaphroditism we can think of? Reproductive assurance. If you have a small population size, and or if you are not a very mobile species, then it might be difficult finding a mate if you're dioecious. Whereas if you're hermaphroditic, any individual you encounter could be a potential mate, because everybody's the same. Everybody's a hermaphrodite, so everybody can potentially mate with everybody else in the population. You also have higher encounter probability, similar, of a potential mate. And it might be possible in some cases to have greater efficiency in mating functions because you're sharing functions, or you're sharing resources, and those resources can be shared between the two sex functions, and that might increase efficiency in some cases. And also, you can change your gender. In other words, the amount of reproduction you accomplish through your male function or through your female function in response to the environment. If there's some environments, including your social environment, where you'd be more successful as a male, then you can just reproduce as a male. If there are other environments, or social, including social environments, where you could be more successful as a female, then you can reproduce as a female. So you can maximize your mating success more easily and better if you're a hermaphrodite than if you're only one sex. So it allows a flexibility of gender depending on whatever the environment is in a particular location. And it also may be advantageous to change your gender based on your own size and age. So smaller individuals might be more successful as one sex, and larger individuals might be more successful as another sex. All right, so how do these different advantages and disadvantages would they tend to predict that you would find diece more in invertebrates and hermaphroditism more in plants? Well, in invertebrates species, there's often a very marked division of reproductive labor between the sexes. So males often compete, often aggressively against each other for mates, and so are often larger and stronger than females and have physical structures such as horns and other behaviors that they use to intimidate opponents, or like trunks you can use to trumpet with in an elephant seal, for example. Females, on the other hand, are more likely to take on tasks related to brood care and upbringing of their young. So in mammals, nursing is an obvious difference between males and females that's both behavioral and anatomical. And so these sorts of things suggest that perhaps in the male and female roles in vertebrates are in conflict with each other, so that it is not easy or maybe even possible for a single individual to successfully carry out both roles. In many species, it's a possibility, maybe. Hard to test experimentally, but something that seems reasonable. Hard to be both a successful male and a successful female. So that really high success depends on separating the two functions. Also, vertebrate animals are tightly integrated. Their bodies are tightly integrated anatomically, neuroanatomically, and physiologically. They have complex sexual structures. So it may not be possible for a single individual to produce both male and female anatomical structures and still be fertile and functional in many species. So it might differ from species to species, but that might be a possibility in many species. And also, well, vertebrates are usually very highly mobile, so they're able to move to find potential mating partners of the opposite sex. They're not likely to be stranded as likely as, for example, plants are, or sessile invertebrates that are attached to the rocks. But in contrast, invertebrate animals and plants in general are much simpler structurally and often consist of somewhat independent modules which can break off without doing much damage, which is not the case in vertebrate animals. And this simpler structure might allow the inclusion of both sex functions within the same individual organism more easily than in more integrated vertebrates. Also, invertebrate animals often release gametes into the water where they fuse, eggs and sperm fuse more or less at random, and also often release larvae into the water. Plants release pollen into the air or water currents or to the bodies of animal pollinators, even seagrasses, and release seeds into the air or water or bodies of seed dispersers. So there's less opportunity for competition for mates and brood care. in invertebrates or plants. So there's less opportunity for the sexes to evolve physical or physiological division of labor in order to perform different functions. So that's the idea. It's not really something that's easy to demonstrate experimentally, but it seems to be a reasonable idea for to explain these patterns. So without these sorts of sex differences, there's less opportunity for the two sexual functions to be in conflict in many invertebrates and higher plants. So possibly making hermaphroditism more advantageous than it would be in other species. Also, plants in many hermaphrodites are sessile, or in other words, attached to the substrate, to the rocks, so they don't move, and so they're less able to make contact with other members of their population. So if they're hermaphroditic, then all individuals contacted can be a sexual partner, not just half. So there's the reproductive assurance advantage that comes into play more for these, for plants and for sessile invertebrates than for mobile vertebrates. All right, let's just do a little tiptoe through the taxa here. See which groups tend to be dioecious, which groups tend to be hermaphroditic. So porifera, the sponges, they're usually sequential hermaphrodites. So they start out as one sex and they change to another sex. Cnidarians, so sea anemones, medusas, are either dioecious or hermaphroditic. Ctenophores, the comb jellies, are largely hermaphrodites. Flatworms are almost exclusively hermaphroditic. Nemerdian worms, dioecious. Rotifers, dioecious. And you can go down through this list and check out some of the others. Point to notice is there's a lot of variability, and 90% of this just has no strong evidence or no strong argument as to why one group is dioecious and another group is hermaphroditic. But presumably many of the sort of ideas that we've put forth already for the advantages and disadvantages might apply in these cases. Bivalves, cephalopods, the squids and cuttlefish, are dioecious, separate males and females. Bivalves, clams, mussels are largely dioecious, separate sexes. There's some hermaphrodites. Nematodes are dioecious, and there's a few that are androdioecious. And what androdioecy is, that some individuals are male and other individuals are hermaphroditic. So that's a different sexual system that's fairly rare, but it occurs occasionally. Echinoderms, in other words, sea stars and sea urchins, are for the most part dioecious. In the chordates, like I've already said, vast majority are dioecious, but there are a few interesting cases of hermaphrodites. Some are simultaneous hermaphrodites, and some are sequential, and that includes mostly in the fish. And here's a nice diagram of the fish, give you a sort of an overview. So in all the major groups, dioecy or gonochorism is found, at least in some species. But in 1, 2, 3, 4, phylogenetic nodes of the evolutionary tree, or I guess 5, 6, 7, there's some form of hermaphroditism. So you can see simultaneous hermaphrodism, in which both eggs and sperm are produced at the same time within a single individual. That occurs in 4 groups. Or you have sequential hermaphrodism. And there, in some cases, the sequence goes from female to male, female first and male second during development. And that occurs as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. And then another form of sequential hermaphrodism is, of course, males first and then females during development. And that occurs also in 1, 2, 3, 4 forms. So the cyprinodontiforms are killifish and live bears. Synbranchiforms are the swamp eels, perciforms, perch-like fish. Allopiforms are the lizard fish. Stomiforms are deep sea fish, diverse body form, hatchet fish, and others. The siluriforms are catfish. The cypriniforms are carp fish, freshwater. Clupeiforms are the herring and anchovies. And the anguilliforms are the true eels. So these are the hermaphroditic groups, either simultaneous or sequential hermaphrodites. And just to reiterate here, these patterns, the reasons for these patterns are just completely unknown. This is a wide open area of research, very active research, very interesting areas of research. So we still haven't explained a lot of this. And we can easily think of advantages and disadvantages, but it's not possible right now to know for sure which are applicable in any particular case. Simultaneous hermaphrodites may occur in habitats where individuals are unlikely to encounter other mating partners, and so it's a form of reproductive assurance, which self-fertilization occurs. Sequential hermaphrodism might occur because as fish get bigger, a larger size might favor mating opportunities for one sex and not the other sex. It's just not known, and so this is an area of active research. Here's the killifish, occurs in mangrove swamps in Brazil, the Rivulus marmoratus. The genus name, I think, has changed now. But you can do a section through the body, and you can find ovarian tissue right next to testicular tissue. These fish can fertilize themselves, and generally do, presumably because it's hard to find mates in these types of environments. And you can get homozygous clones, different homozygous clones of killifish in different regions of mangrove swamps, simply because they're the product of generation after generation of self-fertilization. Clownfish are protandrous. They start out as male, and as they get bigger, they become female. Not simultaneous, but sequential hermaphrodites. Parrotfish, just the reverse. They start out female when they're smaller and become male as they get larger. The general conceptual theory or hypothesis for the evolution of sequential hermaphroditism goes like this. You've got, in protandrous species, as body size increases, the female reproductive success goes up. So why would female reproductive success increase linearly with body size? Well, because females' reproductive success might simply depend on the number of eggs they can lay or the mass of eggs that they're capable of laying. And the larger the mass of eggs that they lay, the higher their reproductive success is. So when a fish is quite small, it cannot lay very many eggs, so it's not going to have a very high reproductive success. But if it's male, it can have a higher reproductive success because the number of females it can mate with is not dependent on the amount of sperm it produces. Other factors might be involved. And it might be that male reproductive success is just not dependent on body size. So after a certain threshold is passed in body size, it's more advantageous for an individual to be female than male. And so you get the protandry. Uh, young smaller fish are male, and then they switch to becoming female when they get older and bigger. In protogynous species, females also increase their reproductive success as their body size goes up for the same reason as in protandrous. But in this case, the males have a huge gain in fitness as they get larger because they need to be large size in order to have any successful matings. And that might be because in these species, males have to compete with other males for females. And their competitive ability is dependent on their size. So once they get to be a large size, they're capable of mating with a very large number of females and can have a huge selective advantage in terms of reproductive success. So, in Darwin's terms, this is a very intense sexual selection going on among males in a protogynous species. And there are lots of examples of both sequential and simultaneous hermaphroditism in invertebrates. Crustaceans go through a molt where they exchange their exoskeleton with a new one as they get bigger, and sometimes that molt, in that molt, they'll change from one sex into the other when they come out of the molt. So both of these species right here that I've pictured here, the bay shrimp and the mole crab, they start out as males, and then when they get a certain size, they go through the molt and they come out of the mold as females when they're big enough. Okay, so here's Emerita analoga. So you start out basically about a 50-50% male and female when they're small. And then as they get larger and larger, get an intermediate size. They're almost 100% male. So this is early in the summer. Go down on the beach, you find pretty much mostly males when they're about 8 millimeters long. And then as they get bigger, they gradually get to a point where they pretty much all become females when they're a bit over a centimeter. And they can be as much as 3 centimeters. And they're 100% females. So this is a species where it's actually never observed. Nobody has observed them yet changing sex. So, but it seems like this must be happening. Hard to imagine what else could be going on here. So this is kind of a mystery at present, but I'm guessing at some point someone will grow these in an aquarium and keep them marked and keep track of individuals over several molts, several generations of molts, and they will demonstrate this sequential hermaphroditism. And here's a shrimp that starts out as 100% males at smaller carapace length and then reaches a threshold around 20 millimeters where they switch over to females after a molt. So again, this particular sexual system, protandry, occurs when the male's reproductive success doesn't change much as they get bigger, but the females does. And that's pretty much the case in most or all species. And here's a species of crab that starts out a 50-50 mixture of the two sexes, and when it gets large enough, it switches over. They all switch over to becoming male. So this is an example where obviously the male reproductive success is going to go up quite a bit as the crab increases to a larger size, presumably because there's a lot of competition, physical aggression going on between males within the male sex for female mating opportunities. And here's a sea anemone, the proliferating anemone or brooding anemone. This species starts out female, and then when it reaches a certain size, it turns into a hermaphrodite. It develops a male function. So clearly, male reproductive success increases with the size of this anemone. And apparently, the species can also reproduce asexually. Females can produce other females asexually. And it also broods their young, females brood their young on the column of the anemone. So you see small baby anemones on the column that gradually will slide off as they get bigger. So all of these things, we really don't know what the selective advantage is in individual cases. And so again, this is an active area of really interesting research going on. Some very common examples of simultaneous hermaphrodites are most barnacles. So barnacles are not mollusks, but crustaceans. And they feed by extending their legs into the water current, filtering out particles of food. So they're a crustacean that basically attaches their head to the surface of the rocks. So they basically glue themselves to the surface of the rocks and can't move. And so they both have both the sexual functions, penis and testes, and also oviduct and ovary. And so they can carry out both sexual functions. And every barnacle is capable of mating with every other barnacle. So this is a understandable sexual system for a species that's glued to the rock and cannot move around to find a sex partner. Makes it easier to mate if every individual is capable of outcrossing with you as either a male or a female function. Almost all flatworms are simultaneous hermaphrodites, but they're mobile. Unlike hermaphrodites, they are mobile swimmers. And they have an interesting mating behavior. Bryozoans are attached and colonial, and they are also simultaneous hermaphrodites. Common example. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of interesting videos. You can see hermaphroditism in action in the marine environment. So these are barnacles in nature. Let's see what they're up to here. So they're extending legs to filter feed particles from the water column. And what else are they doing? All right, so we have this long groping tube, which is the penis, which transports sperm through that tube to another individual who is receptive. And so these barnacles are both feeding and they're looking for mating partners at the same time. And so you can see this in nature quite easily, or if you have barnacles in an aquarium. Set up a GoPro camera. As soon as the tide comes in and they're underwater, they start to become active. So here's an example of mating in mobile flatworms, which are also hermaphroditic. Simultaneous hermaphrodites.
Flatworms have both male and female sex organs. But when it comes time to make little flatworms, they have to decide who plays which role. And that they fight over. The two flatworms rear up, exposing their midsections. Those jutting white nibs aren't weapons, at least not intentional ones. They are actually the worm's penises, a double-barreled inseminator, if they can shoot first. flatworm sex consists of the two attempting to stab their lover with their pointed pair and inseminate each other, an act delicately referred to as penis fencing. But there's nothing delicate about it. Flatworms have been known to gouge holes in each other in battles lasting up to an hour. Why do they cross swords? Producing offspring requires a lot of energy. The winning father can go out and about in the world without any further responsibility. The losing mother absorbs the winner's sperm. It must now work longer and harder to find food and stay alive. The father floats merrily along. The mother crawls along looking for a meal, already the responsible one.
All right, so in this case, both individuals have the hermaphroditic mating type. They're both functionally hermaphroditic, but their gender is different. One of them is 100% male gender, the other was 100% female gender. Defined as, the gametes they use to pass on their genes to reproduce with. So even if you're hermaphrodite, you can have two different, behavioral syndromes based on how you pass on your genes, whether you pass them on through sperm or through eggs. Even in an animal as simple as a flatworm. And I don't know if there's been any documentation, but I'm sure there's some cases in which when two flatworms are mating that both are successful in inseminating the other at pretty much the same time. There's no reason why that couldn't happen. But it remains to be seen. Sea slugs, nudibranchs, are amazing species. They're absolutely beautiful with a very interesting ecology and life history. And they're also entirely, every species that's known is hermaphroditic. So it's interesting that in the sea slugs, there's no gender variation as in the flatworm. So in the flatworm, one individual is male and the other individual is female, and they compete. They fight each other for the sexual function. But in sea slugs, they don't. It's a more equal procedure in which both are equally male and equally female. So their gender is about 50%. And of course, again, in active area research, we don't really know why these differences occur and what in the environment is selecting for these different types of behavior, either now, in the present, or in their evolutionary past. And in many hermaphroditic animals, simultaneous hermaphrodites, there is plenty of evidence of self-fertilization, which I think in most cases is strongly selected against, but it happens because it can't be prevented, especially in free spawners who release their eggs and sperm directly into the water column. So in corals, for instance, they're free spawners. In this particular example, it was found that about the rates of self-fertilization in the field were found to be pretty high, about 34% for one species and 50% for another one. And it suggests that selfing is an important mode of reproduction, perhaps, and that individuals differ quite a bit in the rate of selfing. Again, this paper points out that very little research has been done on this subject of the evolutionary advantages and disadvantages of selfing in these species and whether it's on average selected against or selected in favor because of reproductive assurance. Species that are sessile and can't find a mate, can't be mobile to find mates, and are just passive and rely on luck for the fusion of eggs with sperm. And here's a paper that estimated the selfing rates of different groups of invertebrates and the number of species that they used to get the averages. The T is the outcrossing rate. 1 minus the selfing rate ranged from Looks like around 16% all the way up to 100% outcrossing in different groups. And some of these mobile species are not completely outcrossing. Some actually self-fertilize. Flatworms, 77% of offspring are self-fertilized, and the other 23% are the products of self-fertilization, and among 16 flatworm species. So not only is it anatomically possible, it's it's behavioral as well. And again, unknown why and what the possible selective advantage is of self-fertilization. And here's a large study combining animal and plant species for which the outcrossing rate has been estimated, and this is a histogram. Um, so what is this? Selfing at this end. This is selfing rate, and the proportion of species that have these selfing rates. Um, okay, this is confusing. This is the t estimate. So this is the outcrossing rate. So these are the selfing species. These are the outcrossing species. So we can see that the majority of species are highly outcrossing, which sort of makes sense because selfing is disadvantageous because it results in homozygous mutations or homozygous genotypes, which if you've got a deleterious mutation, it can lower your fitness. But it looks like there's a smaller peak of very highly selfing here at this end. So selfing also can be advantageous. Not clear why it is, maybe for reproductive assurance in these species, or possibly for the same reasons that asexual reproduction might be advantageous. It's less costly. And if you've got a good genotype that's well adapted, then you're basically copying that genotype every generation rather than making different genotypes. Maybe the environment is stable, it's not changing very much. Maybe the mutation rate is low. Maybe there aren't very many parasites. Possibilities, but don't really know. All right, seagrass species. Let's take a look at plants, flowering plants, aquatic plants. The marine species are called seagrasses. And in general, in aquatic flowering plants, the vast majority of species are dioecious, which is in contrast to the terrestrial situation, in which only about 5% are dioecious. The rest are hermaphroditic. And so around here, close to Croatia, dioecious species are Cymodocia, and monoecious are Zostera and Posidonia. So Cymodocia occurs in bays and also in the open Adriatic. The Novigrad Sea, for instance, you can find Cymodocia in deeper levels. And of course, Zostera in bays and estuaries, Posidonia out in the clear open ocean of the Adriatic. All right, in all species, there are two different types of flowers. There are male flowers and female flowers. And so in a monoecious species, those two flowers occur in the same individual. In dioecious species, those two flower types occur in different individuals. So you have different male and female individuals separate from each other. And so here's an example of, in Zostera, the two flower types. So this is a male on top and a female at the bottom. This is the stigma and the style, and down into the ovaries of the females. These are compound flowers with all grouped together on this inflorescence. And these are all the inflorescence for the male. And so the males produce pollen in long filaments that are covered with sticky gelatinous substance that allows them, and they're neutrally buoyant, and they're just transported passively in water currents over to the female flowers where they stick, and the sperm is transferred to the stigma. in both physical and chemical sorts of processes. But in some cases, there have been shown that pollen grains are transported by animals, and they can be transported from male flowers to female flowers by animals. And this was discovered recently in the Thalassia genus of seagrass, which occurs in the Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean and South Pacific. And it's not really known how much reproduction it occurs as a result of transport by animals in this species, but it certainly looks possible. It's a very intriguing example, and it's something that's type of observation that's easy to make nowadays since we have cheap underwater cameras that can take this nice footage easily, time lapse, high density video. Thalassia band, also called turtle grass. Okay, so here we have a male flower producing pollen, sort of sticky filamentous pollen grain, neutrally buoyant, transferred by water currents. You can dive, set up a camera, set up a nice camera. Turn it on and wait. So terrestrial plants produce nectar, sweet nectar that attracts insects. And these seagrasses, the mucilage itself around the pollen grains can attract crustaceans. We've got several different types of species of crustaceans here. Looks like some amphipods, some skeleton shrimp. Isopod. Oops. There's the pollen. That's sticky mucilage. Looks like it's attached to the legs of one of these. Looks like an amphipod to me. So the female flowers don't produce any mucilage, so they're not really attracting the animals. So they might just arrive there by chance, and it's possible they could fertilize, transfer pollen to the female receptive surfaces, the stigma. Any kind of controlled research on this is 10 times different. It's the general rule. Research underwater is 10 times more difficult than research above water. But it's amazing how many animals end up nearby or on these flowers, how much time they spend on these flowers. So it is possible. Still remains to be seen how often this happens and how important it is, and the role of natural selection in promoting or preventing this type of transfer. Okay, and here's the paper that that video was based on. Why are the vast majority of species of seagrasses dioecious? Well, that might be because diece very effectively prevents selfing. And in aquatic species in general, pollen transfer is difficult to control because you're completely dependent passively on water currents. And also because species reproduce asexually by fragmentation of the rhizome. So if the rhizome breaks off, it can form new roots and shoots at a new location and start a new plant entirely. So you can see large genetically identical clones of individuals that have been spread by rhizome fragmentation. And if they reproduce by self-fertilization, then essentially, even though you have different individuals, they're all the same genetic clone. So the genetic effect will be similar to asexual reproduction. So mutations can accumulate, and you have all the disadvantages of asexual reproduction going on. So there might be strong selection against self-fertilization because the passive water movement and the existence of large genetic clones of individuals that spread over the sea surface in shallow areas as a result of asexual reproduction by rhizome fragmentation. So that's one of the hypotheses, probably the most accepted hypothesis for the uh, high incidence of diece in seagrass species. All right, so that's a very quick overview of sexual systems in the marine environment and possible sources of selection in favor of different types of sexual systems in evolution of mating and the mating function of fitness. And it's an active area, very interesting current research, and it seems like most of the research going on right now is to try and study the exceptions to the broad trends. And if you can understand the exceptions, you might be able to understand the broad trends a little bit better. So, for example, people looking at hermaphroditism in vertebrates and selfing rates in vertebrates to see what's going on there, and also diecian plants to see what's promoting the evolution of diece in different types of species in different environments. These are So that's just a capsule summary of sexual systems in the marine environment, the briefest possible summary. And this is a very active area of research currently, and it seems like the main research projects focus on exceptions to the broad trends in order to understand the trends. If you understand the exceptions, then I think that gives you some pretty good insights. So, for example, looking at hermaphroditism in vertebrates and selfing rates in vertebrates to find out, how that system evolves, simultaneous hermaphroditism, and also diaecy in plants. Um, in some seagrasses, for example, and looking at pollination in these species compared to monoecious species to understand how diaecy evolves and sexual systems evolve in seagrasses. So this is what you'll find if you delve into the literature. All right, so the next topic we're going to look at is the evolution of the sex ratio, and this was basically argued. The first argument was made by Ronald Fisher in 1930 in his book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. Ronald A. Fisher is a name you might remember. He's the guy who basically invented analysis of variance and the F test. What does F stand for? Fisher. Okay, so the question is, if you're a female, what should the sex ratio of your offspring be? How should the sex ratio be determined? All right, so this is legitimately a question that you can try to answer through reasoning through the idea of natural selection. What sorts of traits will result in a higher fitness? So here's sort of the reasoning, how the reasoning could go. So given that sex is advantageous and the species is dioecious, in other words, consists of separate male and female individuals, what should the sex ratio be of the population? Which is basically the same as asking, what's the sex ratio? What should it be in females in the clutch, the offspring produced by females? In other words, the sex ratio that maximizes the fitness of that female. So if we have females that can control the ratio of sons and daughters that they produce, what ratio will natural selection favor or sexual selection favor? So one might think that females should produce as many females as possible and very few males, since females and not males produce offspring, so producing many females would seem to ultimately leave more descendants than producing a 1-to-1 ratio. Or will it? Of course, a simple answer to this question is the sex ratio should be 1-to-1 because the species has sex chromosomes and females are XX and males are XY. So when you cross the two, you always get a 50-50 ratio. But regardless of genetics, it stands to reason still that if it were to a female's advantage to modify that 1-to-1 ratio, she would find a way to do so, regardless of the existence of sex ratios. There's always variation in the population, and those females with the favored variation should increase in frequency. So, for example, in many reptiles, sex of the developing embryo is temperature sensitive. Females may selectively abort embryos based on sex. The egg may be more receptive to X than Y sperm, or vice versa. Females may simply allow one sex to starve after birth by not allowing it to nurse or not feeding it solid food. In social insects, the queen can control the sex of her eggs easily. Fertilized eggs are females, and non-fertilized eggs develop into males. Okay, so to answer this question, we'll just do what Fisher did, and we'll create a little model, just like the model that we created for the evolution of sexual reproduction. So just like this model that we already looked at. So what's the sex ratio that maximizes fitness? And we're going to start basically in this model by assuming an extreme scenario. Let's assume that the population consists of 99 females and one male, and we'll calculate the fitness of females that produce different numbers of sons and daughters. And we assume that fitness is measured as the number of descendants. And in this case, we're going to find it as the number of grand offspring. The number of grand offspring of a female is defining her fitness. So let's imagine that each female produces 10 offspring. Let's see. So first imagine we have a female that produces 10 sons, and these sons, and another female that produces 10 daughters. So these go out into the next generation, and the sons compete for mates. So they compete against only one male in the general population. So these 10 sons constitute about 90% of the total male population. And crucially, these 11 males will father all of the next generation. So on average, 10 of the 11 offspring will be fathered by those 10 males produced by our first female here. So about 90% of the following generation are descendants of this female, number one. Second, imagine we have a female that produces 10 daughters. These daughters will go out into the population and compete for mates against the 99 females in the general population. But these females will produce all of the next generation, right? So 10% of them are progeny of our example female here, the second one. So 10% of the following generation are the grand offspring of our female. So although both females produce the same number of offspring, and therefore we might be misled into thinking they have the same fitness, actually their fitness is quite different. And this is because fitness is measured by the relative number of descendants left by different individuals. And the female that produced all males ends up leaving more grand offspring, descendants. So the result is that in a population consisting of all females, there is a natural selection. I guess we'd say this is a sexual selection favoring females that produce sons. And we can switch this around to the reverse situation. Just the exact symmetrical situation, in which the population consists of 99 males and one female. So here, a mother that produces all 10 daughters will be selectively favored. If her 10 daughters use 10 times the resources, 10x resources to raise their offspring, and the other single female in the population uses 1x resources, then those 10 will produce 10 times as much offspring and will parent 90% of the next generation. So conversely, a female that produces 10 sons will grandparent only 10% of the individuals in the second following generation. So in this case, females producing daughters are favored by selection. Now, although these examples just present extremes, the result is generally true anytime the sex ratio deviates from 1 to 1. So the general result is if a population has more males than females, then mothers that produce more daughters leave more descendants. Population have more females than males, then mothers that produce more sons leave more descendants. So the rarer sex always has the greater mating success. And so the only stable equilibrium sex ratio is 1 to 1. Mothers that produce a 1 to 1 sex ratio in their offspring end up with the most grand offspring on average. This is because they can't predict the future sex ratio. However, the future sex ratio will be biased in favor of males about as often as females, assuming other females are evolving to produce the rarer sex. Okay, that's the basic idea. So the sex ratio in the general population should always be hovering around 50% as the females are competing against each other to produce the rarer sex. And so it will in general not be beneficial to overproduce either sex for any female, and a 1-to-1 sex ratio will generally be the fittest. So that's basically the idea that Fisher developed. And it's an example of frequency-dependent selection. And in frequency-dependent selection, the fitness of a type of individual depends on how common it is, its frequency in the population. So in this case, the rare sex is favored by natural selection because of competition within sexes for mating opportunities. So this results in a stable equilibrium in which both sexes coexist in equal numbers. And any deviation from this equilibrium is always going to favor the rarer sex. And so if there's a response to that, and a selective response, it will push the population back towards the equilibrium of 1-to-1. Is Fisher's argument correct? Is this the true reason why sexes are roughly 1-to-1 in most dioecious populations? Well, the truth of his argument would be supported by any exception to the rule of the 1-to-1 sex ratio. So if you find exceptions, then that will tell you, give you some insight into the logic. So the exceptions do occur, and they occur when a mother's offspring invariably mate with each other. So if they don't enter into the general population to compete for mates, that is, they do not compete among members of their own sex for mating opportunities or resources to support their offspring. They just mate with their siblings. Then this situation is called local mate competition. And in this case, Fisher's logic predicts that mothers who produce mostly daughters will leave the most descendants. You just produce as many sons as are necessary to fertilize all your daughters. And so produce as many daughters as you possibly can. So this is favored for two reasons. The number of descendants she leaves is determined by the number of females, not males. And if her daughters reproduce only with their brothers, then the mother need only produce enough sons to impregnate all her daughters. Then she maximizes the number of grand offspring that way, since all her grand offspring come from matings between her own offspring. So where local mate competition occurs, so this prediction is borne out. So it's mostly in insects and other arthropods, including a few marine species. So many bees, wasps, and ants. Fertilized eggs produce females and unfertilized produce males. Females control the sex ratio by storing sperm and using it to produce females. This is called haplodiploidy. So for example, in parasitic wasps, eggs hatch inside the host away from other wasps, so siblings mate with each other. Fig wasps and fig trees, the figs, females lay eggs inside the fig, and these eggs develop into mostly females that are fertilized by their brothers who then die. And in the marine environment, there is one shrimp that is a social shrimp, and the same thing happens. The queen, the female, controls the sex ratio in her offspring, and the vast majority are females. It's not a 1-to-1 sex ratio because it's an example of local mate competition. So I have a nice example of this in one of David Attenborough's videos.
It's far safer to be hidden on the reef itself, within the tunnels of a sponge, for example. These tiny shrimp are no bigger than grains of rice.
So this is a social shrimp, just like a social insect, but it's living inside a colony. Colony is living inside the pores of sponges.
These shrimps are unique. It's recently been discovered that they have a highly sophisticated social system similar to that of bees. All members of the colony are the offspring of one female. She is the queen and the only one to produce eggs. As in a colony of bees, different individuals are specialized for particular tasks. Some are guards and are armed with particularly large and powerful claws.
All females.
They are on watch at all times, ready to tackle intruders. A polychaete worm. For it, a sponge is an excellent hunting ground. In such a maze of tunnels, attack can come at any time from any quarter. Once the guards are alerted, the worm loses its advantage. Better to retreat intact than risk serious injury. The sponge not only makes a safe home for the shrimps, it also supplies them with food so that they never need venture outside. An establishment that provides for all their needs is clearly well worth defending.
So if the exceptions to the one-to-one prediction occur in local mate competition, that sort of implies that the one-to-one sex ratio in general occurs as a result of general mate competition when you don't have local mate competition. So it tends to support the idea that competition for mates in the general population, which is a frequency-dependent process of sexual selection within each of the two sexes, is responsible for establishing a one-to-one sex ratio, or something close to that in most populations. That's just a stable equilibrium outcome, stable strategy that will be favored in general, on average, in any population where competition, general competition of mates is occurring for the reproductive function in a sexual species, dioecious sexual species. And we have this nice marine example of local mate competition now that we didn't used to have. Okay, so far we've been looking at sexual systems, so the general problems related to hermaphroditism, dioecy, outcrossing, gender, evolution of the sex ratio. Now we're going to the next logical subject, which is evolution of the mating system. So again, we're focusing on the interface between organisms and one portion of their environment, namely their potential mating partners of the opposite sex and competitors of the same sex. And so the mating system is simply the pattern of matings between females and males. It has two components: the number of mates that any individual has, and that can be simultaneous or sequential. And the second component is the strength of the bonds between mating pairs. And each of these are subject to selection, sexual selection, natural selection. Animal mating systems are dominated usually by a basic sexual asymmetry that's present in most species, but not all species. And that is that egg production is usually costly while sperm production is cheap. So as a result, females tend to invest more of their energy and potential fitness in each mating, and therefore there are evolutionary consequences. Egg production, eggs are large, can be large and immobile. They're crammed with food for the developing embryo. Um, Therefore, egg production is limited over the lifetime of the female, and the number of matings possible is limited by the amount of resources that are available. So, limited matings and a high energy investment in the egg for each mating means that females are generally more selective in choosing their mates than males. On the other hand, sperm production is cheap. Sperm are small, a little more than DNA with a propeller, and unlimited numbers means an unlimited number of potential matings by males. An unlimited potential number of matings means that males can increase their reproductive success virtually without limit, simply by mating with as many females as possible. And so males are generally less selective in choosing their mates and often compete against each other very intensely for mating access to females. And this is why Darwin was biased in defining sexual selection in terms of competition with males, because it's much more obvious than competition among females for mates, which can be much more subtle and difficult to observe, but can be just as intense. So females usually don't benefit by mating with multiple males, tend to be choosier. Males invest little in each mating, so can benefit by mating with multiple females. Compete for mating opportunities. Also, another asymmetry is that males can't really determine paternity. All right, so that creates a different dynamic than if they could determine paternity. And this asymmetry has a name. It's named after the first person who pointed it out and studied it, Angus Bateman. It's called Bateman's principle. And the principle is simply the female reproductive success. In most species, of course, not all, there are tremendous amount of variability. But in most species, female reproductive success is typically limited by resources. Male reproductive success is typically limited by access to mates. And therefore, males can increase their fitness without limit just by increasing their number of mates. There's no limit. The more mates, the higher your reproductive fitness. Females can increase their fitness only a little bit by increasing the number of mates until they run out of resources. And then that's it. There's a limit. They can't go any farther than that. All right, so that's the basic asymmetry that Bateman pointed out. Or another way to state this is that you can state it without referring to males and females. You can just say, the sex whose mating success is limited by resources generally has a lower variance in reproductive success, whereas the sex whose reproductive success is limited by the number of mates generally has a much higher variance in reproductive success. There's another way of stating it, without biasing it in favor of males or females in any direction. So in other words, if your mating success simply depends on the number of mates, then that sets up an intense competition in which some individuals are very successful and may reproduce with pretty much the entire population of the opposite sex, and therefore have a very high mating success, while others have a very low mating success. And that represents a very high variation in mating success. Whereas the sex that is limited by resources generally has a very low variance in mating success because they all, if they all have roughly the same amount of resources shared among themselves, then they will all have relatively the same mating success. Okay, so it'll be a lower variance in mating success. So that's the basic idea. And, if you look in the animal kingdom, generally it's the males that have the higher variance in mating success because a few males can outcompete the rest for access to female mates. So they have a high reproductive fitness, whereas the rest of the males have a relatively low reproductive fitness. All right, so this principle, Bateman's principle, is kind of the principle that's sort of the conceptual organizing principle for understanding evolution of animal mating systems, which we'll look at in the next lecture next week. All right, that's it for today. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.